Hello, my name is Matthew Dipple with Airtight Engineering, and in this video, we are going to be working through Module 2 of the Getting Real About Home Energy workshop for real estate agents here in Saskatchewan. Module 2, we'll talk about building codes and energy labeling. So let's begin. A bit of an overview. First of all, let's talk about some energy benchmarking concepts. So how do we actually tell whether a house is energy efficient or not? Next, we'll look at the building codes, specifically as they relate to energy efficiency. Then we'll talk about energy efficiency in Saskatchewan, a bit of our history, which is actually quite a proud history here in the province. We'll look at EnerGuide labeling and why it's important, as well as some other energy certification programs here in Canada. And we'll end off looking at some of the future trends that we see happening here in the country. So energy benchmarking concepts, so measuring energy efficiency of houses. Let's start by, if you reach back into your consciousness way back to high school, let's think about energy units. So we won't dwell too much on this, but we do need to talk a little bit about units of energy, so ways that we measure energy. I'll look at two right now. The first is gigajoules, and the second is kilowatt hours. These might sound like just completely made up words. What the heck is a gigajoule? But a gigajoule is a very large unit of energy. And on the right-hand side in the table, we've got some examples of how much energy a gigajoule is, and then also a kilowatt hour, which is a much smaller unit of energy. So 1 gigajoule is the equivalent of surfing the web for 5,500 hours, whereas a kilowatt hour would allow you to surf the web for about 20 hours. If you were toasting bagels, you get 3,000 bagels toasted with a gigajoule versus 11 bagels toasted with 1 kilowatt hour. And a refrigerator, we could run it for 30 weeks with 1 gigajoule of energy, whereas with a kilowatt hour, we could only run that refrigerator for 18 hours. In terms of the total average Canadian household energy use, the average household in Canada uses about 100 gigajoules of energy per year. That translates into close to 28,000 or 27,800 kilowatt hours of energy in a year. So that's total energy use. That's heating, cooling, lights, appliances, all of it. And the reason that we're talking about these two particular energy units is a gigajoule you're most likely to see on a home's EnerGuide label. So when we're looking at ranking home energy efficiency, and kilowatt hours you're most likely to see on Energy Star appliance labels, on something like your power bill, for example. We use often the kilowatt hour as the energy unit. When we talk about benchmarking home energy use, we have two main ways that we do it. The first is to compare to an equivalent code minimum or baseline house. So it's saying, here's sort of a standard run-of-the-mill house built to the building code versus this house. How are we lining up? Are we actually worse than that standard today built to the building code house? Are we better? How much better? And then the second thing that we can do to look at house energy efficiency is to use a specific energy use metric. And what that is looking at the amount of energy a home uses per unit of floor area. So we'll look at both of these and we'll look at their strengths as well as their weaknesses. I should note that in Saskatchewan, the building code uses the comparison metric, so that first metric. Whereas in BC, the building codes there use specific energy use metrics. So a bit of a difference, but we see most of the country following that the comparison style of benchmark. So let's look at that first one, comparing to the code minimum. This involves creating two energy models. The first is the model of the proposed house, and the second is the model of the reference or the code minimum house. And so those two energy models are the same in terms of size, geometry, location, number of windows and doors, way that they're oriented, etc. So the geometry is the same for those two houses. The things that are different would be the energy performance. So something like the amount of insulation in the walls, or the efficiency of the hot water heater. So those are a couple examples of the differences between what you're proposing and then that code minimum house. And then we compare the two. So we can see on the right-hand side, this is from an EnerGuide label, and we've got that 90 gigajoules per year and the arrow on the bottom, and it says a typical new house. The writing's kind of small, but that's where that code baseline house would be. And then the 74 on the top, it says this house. So this house is using 74 gigajoules per year of energy versus a typical house or our code minimum house, which would use 90. So with this benchmark, we can see that this particular house is actually more efficient than the run-of-the-mill code minimum house. Some of the strengths of this approach are that it helps us to contextualize the impact of upgrades against this very meaningful benchmark. And it's pretty easy for even a layperson to kind of understand what it means, right? Oh, yeah, this house is better than the code minimum. Great. I can understand what that means. That sort of the benchmark approach is pretty accessible in terms of the average person. Some of the weaknesses of this approach are the building code, or what our benchmark is actually always changing. So over time, our building code gets more and more efficient and encourages higher efficiency homes. And so that baseline that we're comparing to actually is shifting over time. So what happens in 5 years when the benchmark house is no longer 90 gigajoules per year? In this case, maybe it's 70 gigajoules per year. All of a sudden, this house that looked really good is not looking quite as hot as it used to be. Also, it's hard to compare houses of different size with this method. So the baseline house at 90 gigajoules per year is the same size as our house that we're proposing to build at 74 gigajoules per year. But what happens if we're trying to understand how efficient this house is compared to a house that's twice as big? It's hard to do with this baseline approach. As well, it doesn't capture the form inefficiencies. So let's say we've got a house that's got uh, 50 windows. That's a huge amount of windows. And that's actually, well, okay, first of all, it wouldn't be allowed by code, but that's actually not going to be very efficient because those windows are not very good insulators, right? However, the baseline approach doesn't capture that inefficiency because our baseline house, by definition, has the same amount of windows as our proposed house. So we actually don't get to see the fact that in general, those windows just make the house less efficient. So that brings us to our second way of comparing, which is the specific energy use method. So here we're looking at the total energy that a home uses and then dividing it by the floor area of that house. So my example on the right, we've got a home that uses 30,000 kilowatt hours of energy per year. The home has a floor area of 250 meters squared, which is roughly 2,600 square feet. So the home specific energy use is 30,000 divided by 250 equals 120 kilowatt hours per meter squared of floor area per year. So some of the strengths of this method are it's not affected by changes to the building code, right? There's no baseline. 30,000 kilowatt hours is the same, doesn't matter what the building code is. And we can compare really well between houses of differing size, right? So because we're looking at a per unit of floor area, if you have a house that's twice as big, well, you're still measuring energy use per unit of floor area. It also encourages more efficient building shapes. So we are accounting for, say, the number of windows, or if a building is built to be quite compact, or is built with a lot of wings and dormers, etc. Some of the weaknesses, as you might be able to see, the first one is it's less intuitive. So I could look at 120 kilowatt hours per meter squared and say, well, is that good? I don't know, right? Is that a good energy efficient house, or is that poor in terms of energy efficiency? So it does require a sense of what is efficient and what is inefficient. As well, it can actually also mask size related inefficiency. So let's say you've got a 10,000 square foot house for 2 people. Is that really efficient? Is that an efficient use of housing? We could argue back and forth on what's reasonable, but our metric here isn't going to show any of that. Okay, so we've laid the groundwork. Now it's time to just talk briefly about building energy codes, specifically as they relate to Saskatchewan. So starting with just codes in Canada, building codes, their purpose is to set minimum standards for building design and construction here in Canada. And codes are developed by the National Research Council, which is part of the federal government, and they develop what's called a model code, which provinces and territories can then adopt. Currently, all of the provinces and territories have adopted the model codes or created their own code that's heavily based on the model codes. So we've got some pretty good kind of agreement across the country at this point. And at present, model codes get updated every 5 years or so, and then it's up to the provinces and territories to adopt the newest version. And one thing to remember is that the building code lays out the minimum building performance that you can get a building permit for. It's not that the building code is sort of what we should always be striving for as best practice. It's the minimum bar. Fun fact, here in Saskatchewan, the first building code that we adopted was in 1984. So not too long ago, actually. On that theme of history and timeline, let's just look at a really brief timeline of building codes. So in the 1900s in Canada, we first saw larger cities begin to implement standards, and the main goal was to prevent fire and disease. So cities like Vancouver, Montreal, Toronto are starting to implement building standards. In 1941, the federal government started to develop a set of standards. So they developed the first national building code. In 1984 was when Saskatchewan first implemented the national building code. They implemented the 1980 model code edition. 1997, the federal government publishes the first model building energy code. So now we're seeing energy efficiency being introduced into the codes for the first time. And fast forward, 2019 is when Saskatchewan first implemented energy efficiency into its codes. So it implements the energy code both for residential buildings and then also for larger buildings as well. So 2019 is quite recent in Saskatchewan that we've actually implemented energy efficiency in our codes. Here is what a prairie house in different eras might look like. So we can see sort of the evolution of energy efficiency in the code. Likewise, we can also see energy efficiency evolution in the way that we build. So early 1900s here on the prairies, a house might have had brick walls, likely sawdust or wood chip insulation, might have had a fireplace, natural ventilation. So when I say natural, it means just gaps and drafts in the house. Windows were likely single pane and made of wood, probably sliders. So that's the kind of style of operation of the windows. Pre-1984, so now we're looking at the kind of later 1900s. We've got 2x4 walls. We do have fiberglass insulation now, sometimes with that like craft paper facing to it. We've got gas furnaces as of the 50s. And we're starting to see exhaust fans, so adding a little bit of mechanical ventilation in our bathrooms. Windows are probably double pane, maybe aluminum frames, maybe still wood frames. And then post 1984, remember, this is when the building code has come into effect here in Saskatchewan. Now we're seeing 2x6 walls, so thicker walls, which means more fiberglass insulation. We've got mid-efficiency furnaces. Some of them now have fresh air intakes. So we've got a bit more ventilation ability, and we're starting to see double pane, probably still some wood and aluminum, but also some plastic frames, so PVC double pane windows. And then fast forward to today. So we've got 2x6 walls. Sometimes we're starting to see additional insulation wrapped around. So maybe 2 inches of insulation wrap. We've got ICF or insulated concrete forms for our foundation. So we're starting to see more basement insulation, high efficiency furnaces, HRVs, which are heat recovery ventilators. So that's providing even better quality ventilation. And now we're seeing triple pane. So triple pane windows with PVC frames or with other types of frames. So we've seen a large evolution over the past 100 years or so as far as energy efficiency is concerned here on the prairies. And I like this graph. This is from Edmonton, but it would still be very applicable for cities and towns here in Saskatchewan. And here's some of the information they found on just the main wall insulation R value by decade. And so this is R value is a reflection of how much insulative value that wall has. So the numbers are a little small here, but we can see 1910s, 1920s, on average, we're seeing R10 of insulation in the walls. And then that's increasing over the years up to the 2000s and 2010s, where on average we're seeing R17 or R18 in the walls. So almost doubling there the amount of insulation over that 100-year period. I want to talk too briefly, just because this is such a great made in Saskatchewan story about the prairie housing efficiency history here in the province. And the focus of this is the Saskatchewan Conservation House. This was developed by the Saskatchewan Research Council in Regina. It's actually still standing today in Regina. And it was a research project to understand how efficient can we make a house in order so that it can be mostly passively heated, so passively by, say, the sun or the heat from the occupants, and passively cooled, as opposed to building a house that needs a large amount of active heat from a furnace or active cooling from an air conditioner. So some of the highlights of this is this project developed the first heat recovery ventilator, or HRV, and this concept is now used all over the world. This also developed the first blower door air tightness test for this project. Again, this is a test that's now used worldwide in building energy efficiency. As well, there was an early drain water heat recovery system that was developed. This technology is also used across the world. So we were doing some really amazing research here in the 70s in Saskatchewan when it comes to home energy efficiency. Here's a picture of that house today in Regina, the north part of the city. So interesting, you'll notice that some of the fancy mechanical systems are gone. So those fancy solar tubes on the front. Also, some of I think the fancy drain water heat recovery system that they had installed, it was a little bit cumbersome. So those are no longer there anymore. But the envelope, so the shell of the building, the insulation and the air tightness are still chugging along, saving energy, and it is still an extremely efficient house because of the air tightness and the level of insulation in the envelope. So a couple of things. This really focused on a conservation first approach. So can we conserve energy first before trying to heat and cool? And some of the results, the R2000 standard you might be familiar with here in Canada, this was based on that research here in Saskatchewan. And the Passive House standard, which is an international standard coming out of Germany, was also based on largely, to a large extent, the research that came out of this project. The German building scientists came across it, said, wow, what a great idea. And they created the Passive House standard. So let's look a little bit at the building code energy and the building and energy codes of today that we're using in Saskatchewan today and what they mean for energy efficiency here. So today, the model building energy codes consist of two parts. We've got part 9.36 of the building code, and this is for houses. So this is the world that we're living in when we're building a house and also other certain small buildings. Then we've got the National Energy Code for buildings, and this has to do with larger buildings or what we would call higher consequence small buildings. If you're wondering what that means, higher consequence building would be one where, let's say maybe it's a church or some other assembly space, like a community center, say, that could have a lot of people in it. That would be a higher consequence building because it can have a large number of people in it. So we really want to make sure that it's designed well and is able to provide a healthy and safe environment for that large amount of people potentially. Another example could be an industrial facility that might have hazardous materials in it. That would be a higher consequence building, even if it's small. So the energy codes apply to the model codes apply to new buildings as well as to additions, but they do not cover existing buildings or farm buildings at the moment. The scope. So they describe the energy efficiency requirements for the following areas in a building. So the building envelope, that's the shell of the building, the lighting, the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems, the service water, so that's the hot water that we use out of our taps, and the electrical power systems and any motors in the building. And we've also, in these codes, got 3 different paths for compliance. So we've got a prescriptive path that basically says thou shalt. So thou shalt put 17 or R17 insulation in your walls, for example. A trade-off, which says in total, these particular areas have to all add up to a certain amount of energy use and nothing more. And then the performance path, which is a building energy model. So very similar to what we talked about in terms of a proposed and baseline building. We do that exact same thing in order to comply with the code. And we say, here's what we're proposing. Here's how much energy it's going to use. Then we model the code minimum requirements. And as long as our building uses less energy than that code minimum, we're good to go. In Saskatchewan, on January 1st, 2024, we adopted the 2020 model codes. Some of the main efficiency changes with these new codes are we've got increased insulation requirements. We now have optional air tightness testing, which wasn't seen before in the code. We've got updates to the efficiency requirements around lighting and HVAC or heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. And we've also got some tiered energy performance added. So we've got the lowest tier, which is the baseline, and then higher tiers available, which would be, say, 10% better than the baseline or 20% better than the baseline. So currently, we've adopted the lowest tier of the NECB, so that's for large buildings, and we've adopted tier 2 of the residential code. So that's 10% more efficient than the baseline. As of January 1st, 2025, we'll be adopting tier 3 for residential buildings. That's 20% more efficient than the baseline. So 10 or 20% more efficient than baseline is not at this point a stretch. It's probably just aligning with best practice, what most builders are doing already in the province, but good to know that that code is starting to increase in its requirements. Talking about some future code directions, nationally, we've got some guiding documents. First of all, the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change. This came out in 2016. And in it, it signals provinces are to adopt the net zero energy ready model codes by 2030. So it's really charting a path for what we're going to see in future energy codes. So we're going to see energy efficiency play a bigger and bigger role as the 2025 code and then the 2030 code come out. We've also got the development of alterations to existing buildings energy codes. So now we're looking at actually having energy requirements when you're altering an existing building, not just when you're building new or building an addition to an existing building. And then in 2022, the 2030 emissions reduction plan came out. So this is the sort of updated national strategy. And some of the building relating things that it talked about is the development of standards and incentives for transitioning heating systems off of fossil fuels. So looking to move more and more buildings towards electrification. We've got building code reform to incorporate low carbon building materials. So now the codes are going to be starting to look not just at energy, but also at the carbon intensity of the materials we're using. So are we using steel and concrete, which have a lot of carbon emissions associated, or are we using wood and, kind of materials that might sequester carbon even? That 2030 plan also looked to develop an approach to require EnerGuide labeling of homes at the time of sale. This is of particular interest to you as real estate agents. So this is not currently happening, but it's a potential kind of future direction here in Canada is this potential for requiring energy benchmarking of homes at the time that they would get sold. So a sale would trigger that requirement for labeling. So again, something that's not here at the moment, but is potentially on the horizon as signaled in that 2030 emissions reduction plan. And we also see now a focus starting to come in about climate adaptation. So we're looking not just at energy efficiency, but also at the ability of a home to withstand sort of climate shock or kind of extreme climate events. And we're going to see that start to be incorporated into home labeling as well. So we've mentioned the EnerGuide program a couple of times. So let's take a dive in and look more at what this program is. So EnerGuide is the Government of Canada's home energy rating system, and it was designed to help homeowners to benchmark their energy use, to understand it, and also to improve the use of energy and the energy efficiency of their homes. It first launched in 1998 and has been updated and kind of kept current by Natural Resources Canada since then. The program involves a home visit. So you'll have an energy auditor that comes to your home and takes some measurements, asks you a few questions, tests amount of insulation, measures windows, all those different things. They'll also do a blower door test. So they'll test the air tightness of your home. We'll look at a blower door test a little more later. And then they'll complete an energy model. So using software that's part of the EnerGuide program, they'll complete an energy model of your home, compare that to the baseline home, and they'll send you some documentation. So we can see here a picture of the EnerGuide label that's showing this particular house. The energy model is showing it at 84 gigajoules of energy use per year versus 95 for a typical new house of this size and shape. So we've got a few different, a couple homeowner services that I'll highlight here within the program. So the first is the basic service, which includes an EnerGuide label and a homeowner information sheet. So you get the label, often you'll see those put on the electrical panel, and then you get a homeowner information sheet that just tells you a little bit more about where your home is using energy. Or the other option is the renovation upgrade service. So it includes everything from the basic service, but it also provides for you a renovation upgrade report, which gives you a pathway to improve the energy use of your house. So it'll give you some fairly templated kind of energy efficiency measures that you could do in your home. So one of them might be adding insulation to your attic. Another might be getting a new Energy Star rated water heater. Those are a couple examples of what you might see in that renovation upgrade report. And we can see these two screen captures here of the first page of each of those reports. So they're pretty well put together. They're nice and visual. They're easy to understand. They're quite useful documents for a homeowner. So let's dissect the label a little bit more. So here's a picture of the top half of an EnerGuide label. We'll see the bottom half on the next slide. So first of all, at the top there, the biggest number is the rating. So this is the rating of the home's energy consumption. And I'll just note that this is rated using standard conditions. So it's not taking into account the fact that, Jimmy, your teenage son, showers 4 times a day, pretty much for, 20 minutes each. And so your hot water bill is through the roof. No, it's taking into account sort of average conditions. So for every home, that means 4 occupants, 2 adults and 2 children. That means a sort of Canadian average amount of hot water use, an average amount of appliance use, etc. So it's not going to capture some of those particulars of the occupant energy use in your home, but that's going to help really highlight the home's performance as opposed to your habits as occupants. Then below that number, we've got the comparison. So that baseline, that building code baseline, if your house was built just sort of to the code minimum requirement today, how much energy would it be using? So we can see how your home is performing versus that baseline. And then we've got our target. So that's the 0 gigajoules per year. That's the best we can get. And this is the idea of net zero. So this could be achieved by having a home that actually uses no energy, which is let's face it, impossible. So the way that we realistically get to 0 gigajoules per year is having some sort of generation on site to offset our energy use. So most often this would be something like solar panels. Oops. Okay, the bottom half of the label, we've got a bit more detail. So we've got the breakdown, which shows the different types of energy. It's probably a little small on the slides here, but this one is showing some amount of gigajoules worth of oil, heating oil, some amount of electricity, and then some amount of natural gas, and kind of breaking out energy use by those three fuel types. We can see the different areas of our house that are consuming the most energy. So on the right, we've got that little kind of donut graph, and we can see that space heating on this house is using the lion's share, coming in at kind of the biggest amount, versus space cooling is only 2% of our energy use. We've got water heating, ventilation, lights and appliances, other electrical, and it's showing us where those different pieces of the pie are landing. And we also have the greenhouse gas emissions of this home. So this house is using 10.4 tons per year, or is producing 10.4 tons per year of greenhouse gas emissions. So this would be based on our provincial grid, based on how much electricity versus natural gas versus other fuel type we're using in this home. So some of the implementations of this EnerGuide program, how it gets used, it's actually the basis of a number of certification programs here in Canada. And it's also the basis of a lot of funding here in Canada. So we'll talk about the Saskatchewan Home Energy Loan Program later. We'll talk about the Canada Greener Homes Grant. Those are both funding programs, and they both use the EnerGuide label as their basis. So the EnerGuide isn't just a sticker that's telling you how much energy your home is using. It can also be the key to unlocking funding opportunities for energy efficiency improvements. It's also the main labeling program in Canada. So we expect it to kind of be the basis for a lot of government initiatives going forward as well. So let's take a look at some of these other energy certification programs. So we've looked at EnerGuide, and what else is out there? So this slide, we'll just spend a couple slides, just a quick overview, but here's the landscape in Canada for some of the more popular certification programs. So those ones on the left, we've got two that are administered by the federal government, and they rely on the EnerGuide program. So I'll just distinguish EnerGuide. EnerGuide isn't saying that your house is efficient. It's just ranking how much energy it uses. So you can get an EnerGuide label for any house, no matter how efficient it is. Versus some of these programs, so like Energy Star or R2000, they're actually, if you get that certification, it's actually saying, yes, your house is performing to a certain level of efficiency. So that's sort of the difference that we're talking here. So Energy Star is one. R2000 is another. Those are administered by the Government of Canada. Then we've got in the middle some building industry organization certifications. So there's the Net Zero Home program. This is through the Canadian Home Builders Association. We've also got the Built Green label, it's more popular in Alberta and a little bit in BC too. It's also kind of building industry led. Then over on the right-hand side, we've got 3 examples from independent research institutes that are behind these labels. So you might be familiar with LEED in commercial buildings. Well, there's also a LEED for homes, which is administered by the Canadian Green Building Council. So it's a little less well-known or popular, but there is LEED for homes. We've got Passive House, which I mentioned before. This is out of Germany, the Passive House Institute in Germany, and then the Living Building Challenge, which is out of the States. So 3 examples of independent research institute-led certifications. So all of these are third-party verification that a home is performing to a certain level of efficiency. And so these can be great options for clients who want to show off, to showcase how efficient their home is, and to help others to see the value of that. So let's just do a quick comparison of those. I know this is sort of a big table for one slide, but we'll just talk through it a little bit to just compare what these look like. So I've sort of listed the different certifications in terms of the least stringent to the most stringent. So built green, we can see the energy use reduction versus code minimum. If you get the built green certification, you're coming in around 10% better than code minimum. Energy Star is going to put you in the 20% range, as will LEED. R2000 is now more energy use reduction. We're at the 50% range. Net zero homes, okay, so it's 100%, but there's this with offset asterisk. So it's to be net zero, of course, you have to have net zero energy use. Generally, in terms of efficiency, it's following along with the R2000 very closely, and then you're just adding solar to that. So it's going to look similar to R2000, but with enough solar added to offset that remaining energy use. Passive house coming in at roughly 70% more efficient than a code built home today, and living building challenge 70%, and it's got offset as well. So we won't talk too much about total energy use intensity or thermal demand intensity, but if you're familiar with those, you can take a look there. Air tightness, which is really a key metric in terms of efficiency, we can see how they get more stringent as we go to the right as well. So ranging from 3 air changes per hour, 50 pascals. You don't have to know exactly what that means. Just know that that smaller is better in terms of air tightness. So ranging from 3 all the way to passive house, which is 0.6, so the most stringent. And then we can also see the focus beyond energy. So built green, LEED, and living building challenge all have quite a wide range beyond just energy use, whereas some of those other standards are more focused on energy use. I will say that the Passive House Institute standard is the most stringent in terms of energy efficiency. It's kind of recognized around the world as being the most stringent energy efficiency standard, and the Living Building Challenge, in my opinion, is the hardest standard in general. First of all, it's got very stringent energy targets, but then you look at some of the other areas that it's looking at. So place, water, health, happiness, materials, beauty, equity. It's looking at a very holistic view of a building and how we build. And so it's moving far beyond just energy. I know of only, I think there's like less than 5 buildings in Canada that have actually achieved the Living Building Challenge standard. So a good example of where we can go when we put our mind to it, though. So to summarize from this section, from Module 2, we've got some building codes here in Canada. They're in force in Saskatchewan. In the future, we see that building codes are moving towards net zero quite quickly. So probably in the next decade, we're going to see building codes requiring much more efficiency out of our buildings than we've had in the past. And the goal is to set us up to be able to power those buildings with renewables on site. So that idea of net zero, can we produce on site as much energy as we're using in a building? We also looked at home energy labeling. So we can see that it's a useful tool for benchmarking our energy use, for also achieving a certification for our house. Finally, we looked at the EnerGuide labeling program, and we saw that it's likely to remain the core of our Canadian programs into the future, whether those are energy benchmarking programs or whether those are grants or funding opportunities or the building code compliance. EnerGuide is here to stay, and it's kind of going to remain the core for homes. Great. Thanks so much. This is Module 2. I'll see you in Module 3.